Welcome to Medmark's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled The Potential Life Sciences Implications of the Election. I'm Kate Klaus, staff attorney in Medmark's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmark and today's presenter, Jeffrey Shapiro, thank you for joining us. Mr. Shapiro is a director with Hyman, Phelps McNamara and specializes in medical device law, advising and representing companies before FDA for more than 25 years. He has experience in FDA regulation of medical devices, including product clearances and approvals, MDR and Part 806 reporting requirements, labeling and advertising, recalls, and responding to Form 483s and warning letters. Mr. Shapiro also counsels clients on FDA requirements governing in vitro diagnostics and human cellular and tissue-based products. Mr. Shapiro is an expert in FDA's regulation of combination products, including preparation of requests for designation. As an advisor to startups, mid-sized and large medical device manufacturers, Mr. Shapiro recognizes the operational and financial considerations involved in managing compliance and creating regulatory strategies. Mr. Shapiro actively contributes to industry conversations on medical device regulations. He is a member of the editorial advisory board for both MDDI and Update magazines and co-editor of 2 textbooks. He's a frequent speaker and contributor to his firm's FDA law blog, among other publications. Mr. Shapiro is a lecturer and official literati teaching the University of Maryland's Regulatory Law Medical Devices course. He currently serves on the Medical Devices and Diagnostics Committee of the Food and Drug Law Institute. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Jeff.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. And I hope that everyone can hear me. Send a chat to Medmark, the Medmark folks, if you're having any audio problems. This is one of those presentations that would be a lot more fun if we could all get together in the same conference room or auditorium. Unfortunately, we are going to have to do it by Zoom, thanks to the circumstances of 2020. But I hope to take a lot of questions at the end and do this somewhat interactively. I think I'll touch on a lot of issues that you might be interested in. And this is also a little different from a typical device regulatory presentation that tends to be more technical. I've got 5 key things about pre-market applications that you need to know, that sort of thing. This will be at a kind of a higher level and hopefully a little bit more fun, but also, again, lends itself to questions at the end, I think. So I'm going to, without further framing this, get started. And the first thing, when I agreed to take this on as a volunteer, I started thinking about, how do we think about politics and FDA? And because, the whole rationale for an expert agency like FDA is that it's intended to provide expert scientific review of complex devices and drugs to make sure that they're safe and effective in the way that their sponsors and industry say they are before allowing them into the market. And then also to ensure, as experts, again, to enforce certain rules of the road about what you can say. So these are not just like any consumer device product. These are, subject to heightened government scrutiny by a trained cadre of experts. That's the whole idea behind FDA. And yet, I think we all know that there is a political element. And one thing to note about that is that FDA is part of the executive branch. So as we all know, we have 3 branches of government. We have the Congress that makes the laws. We have the administration, the executive branch, which implements them. And the head of the executive branch is the president. And the president is the sort of the embodiment of the executive branch and is the only political official who is elected by the entire nation, as opposed to a local area, a state or jurisdiction. And so there is politics in the electric branch, there's philosophy, and it does it can get down to FDA. So we have to kind of feel our way through this. And my main contention is going to be that actually, in terms of the stuff that I do as device regulatory counsel, as many of you do, whether it's regulatory affairs professionals and the like, when you're involved with medical devices or drugs or biologics, that work continues without significant changes. It certainly doesn't change with the election. But there is some role for politics in FDA and differences between the parties that will affect the agency going forward. So we'll kind of explore all that, and you may disagree with some of my conclusions. You may agree with some of them, and this is not going to be a partisan talk, by the way. I'm going to try not to have people mad at me on either side of the aisle. I thought of 5 things that need to be kind of thought about, and loosely, that's how this talk is structured. One is, political appointees. Not everyone at FDA is a scientist with a career job. There are political appointees, and they're at the top. The bureaucratic structure of FDA, and also where FDA fits within the executive branch structure. The FDA's statutory and regulatory mission, the laws, the statutory laws from Congress, the regulatory rules that have been set out primarily by prior administrations over the years and don't change very quickly. And then Congress, there are party philosophies about FDA. There's a difference in how each party talks about FDA. And then the administration, the Democrats and Republicans, whether it's in Congress or the administration, have different philosophies about FDA. So those are some of the things that could tone, emphasis, maybe some measures that could change with an administration. So that's kind of the introduction or the overview of how we're going to talk about FDA. But it's going to be kind of loose. I don't have headings, and we'll just try to have fun. So first of all, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, what is a political appointee? There's actually a definition from the Office of Government Ethics. A political appointee is any employee who is appointed by the president, the vice president, or agency head. Agency head, in this case, I suppose, would be the FDA commissioner. So as of 2016, there were about 4,000 political appointment positions throughout the administration, and 1,200 of those required Senate confirmation. The head of FDA is one of those. So that's inherently a political process. So just to think about, just to kind of orient us to where FDA is in the scheme of things. This org chart is actually for a high-level chart of the Department of Health and Human Services. And, I challenge you to quickly find FDA. It's the second column from the right in the center, about 3 down, you'll see FDA. But you can see that HHS is a very large bureaucracy with a lot of significant parts. Just to the left of it, FDA is CMS, which pays the bills for a lot of drug and device companies and is very important in the healthcare system. Right above FDA is the CDC. So down below, you can see NIH. So there's all kinds of agencies and offices here, and FDA is one of those. So it's an operating division. So I'm trying to provide some perspective of how far down the bureaucracy, the regulation of drugs and devices really goes. So the HHS Secretary supervises FDA. The HHS Secretary is politically appointed, so that person is going to share the philosophy of the president, otherwise they wouldn't get the appointment, or they won't last. And the FDA commissioner is also politically appointed. And so certainly they set priorities at a high level. So just to give you some examples, the current secretary before the pandemic announced these 4 priorities. And I think it's fair to say that these have a political spin on them. So the opioid crisis, now that's a public health crisis, which frankly, some would say was neglected during the Obama years, not addressed, with the full powers of the government. And at least the Republicans in the Trump administration coming in felt that that was something that they really needed to address. And of course, the crisis was particularly strong in the Midwest and some of the New England states, but the Midwest states were critical to Trump's election. So this is in some sense, the political system responding to a constituency. Health insurance reform probably is a reference to the fight over Obamacare that, of course, went on for many years and the Republican opposition to it. Drug pricing is interesting because that's always been a Democrat objective or concern. And I think it's fair to say that Trump stole that one during his campaign and said he was going to focus on it, and in fact has put a lot of emphasis on it. And then value-based care, health IT, price, quality, transparency, reduced regulation. Those are Republican themes for healthcare. Note that FDA isn't on this list, not explicitly. Maybe, some of FDA's activities may play a role in drug pricing, but it's secondary or sort of indirect. And a lot of this stuff, reduced regulation generally could include FDA, but you can see that a lot, and this is a theme, the money, follow the money. Both parties are much more concerned with pricing and with healthcare financing than with directly impacting FDA as part of their political program. So that's the current secretary's priorities. Now, I found, and I have a site down at the below. This came from HFMA, whatever that is, .org. And you'll note I've mostly tried to include my sources throughout when I felt like it, but it's not that important. These are ripped from the headlines. But this one I put in the site if you want to go look at it. And this was Biden's potential HHS pick, whose name I can't remember, and what priorities that person would have. And the first one was the public option. So providing public insurance, which of course failed when the Affordable Care Act was passed. It was not included. Now they want to add, this person wants to add it. Antitrust enforcement of hospital M&A, and price negotiations with hospitals for cost control. Again, FDA not really directly mentioned. This is all pricing, healthcare financing, and that seems to be where HHS focuses. So FDA, remember, is only one part of HHS. So that's the Biden HHS priorities if that person were to come in as the head of HHS. And just for fun, as I was looking around, I came across, this was Secretary Leavitt or Levitt under G.W. Bush. I think it was around 2006, 2007, when he was leaving, he listed these accomplishments. And again, this is the HHS Secretary. The first four really don't directly relate to FDA. The fourth one somewhat could. So this was developing a strategy for safety of imported products. That was the time when NAFTA was starting to really kick in, and China had joined the WTO maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, and FDA started to see the companies it was regulating moving to Asia. And in fact, FDA opened an office there, and they did all kinds of things to reorient towards the global manufacturing. And so that's that globalizing the efforts of the FDA bullet at the bottom. And then this one I thought would be, it was kind of interesting, mobilizing the nation's pandemic preparedness and retooling the nation's medical emergency plans. Not sure how well that worked out, but that was back in 2006. So, and then I came across this. This is a story from the Politico in October, just actually a couple of days ago. Interesting thing about Politico is, they're sort of a Washington political gossip magazine to some extent. And they actually are focusing on HHS and FDA in a big way. I've talked to their reporters. I've been quoted in the Politico on device issues, on the LDT issue, which we'll get to. So I don't, they find it very interesting. So this says that there's a mass exodus of HHS staffers jumping ship amid pandemic and fears of a Trump loss. 27 political appointees have left. So that's a lot of political appointees, and those are just the ones that left. And then this quote in red says there will be a mass exodus should the elections go against Trump, predicted a senior department official. Of course, that's actually kind of amusing because by definition, political appointees lose their job when the president loses if the other party comes in. Some of them might stay over as holdovers if they're asked to, but most of them leave. So a pretty safe prediction. Anyway, this just shows you that HHS has a lot of political appointees. They've already, they've apparently got dozens of them. Now, FDA actually, to my knowledge, doesn't. And researching this was very difficult. There's not really a list of FDA's political appointments. So I had trouble finding information. I know, and we know that the FDA commissioner is politically appointed. So is the principal deputy. I believe the chief counsel and the head of external affairs maybe. But these are people very high in the commissioner's office. And I'm not aware that filters down. And if we look at the next slide, this is, actually, it'll be the slide after. But let me just, this is an example of HHS overriding FDA. This is pretty rare. In 25 years, I've not seen this happen before. And this relates to laboratory developed tests, which some of you might know as a very contentious issue really over 30 years as to FDA's authority in this regard, whether they have authority to regulate those tests. And I'm certainly not going to get into that whole story, but FDA did insist on regulating the COVID LDTs, laboratory developed tests, and we'll get into more of that later. But at some point during the summer, HHS said, you're not doing it anymore. And FDA was very unhappy with that. And this last bullet says, Azar's decision is the latest example of Trump administration appointees overruling experts. I don't know how true that is. They didn't provide any examples other than this one. And I agree. This was one where HHS overruled FDA on LDTs. And for that reason, it's remarkable. And the article also said, quote, at some points, the dispute was so intense that it boiled over into screaming matches between Azar and Hahn, four of the sources said. And FDA's device chief, Jeff Shurn, was cut out of crucial HHS meetings leading up to the policy shift. And the article also points out that FDA's own website still insists that it has the power to regulate all manner of lab-developed coronavirus tests. So this did not go down well with FDA, and HHS really bigfooted them. And I cannot think of another example of this. Maybe there is one. Someone can bring that up on the questions. But it was remarkable, and I think it had to do with the pandemic. For the most part, HHS does not get involved really in what FDA wants to do, other than sort of with priorities and emphasis. They, let FDA develop the policies that FDA follows for the most part. So this was a remarkable issue, or incident, I should say. Now, in the previous slide, I pointed out that FDA doesn't have a lot of political appointees. It was a little, as I said, I couldn't quite determine how many, but they're all in the commissioner's office, and there's not very many of them. And most FDA folks are career, even at a high level. And typically they have a scientific background or something relevant. So one interesting wild card here, which could be affected by the election is Trump very recently, October 22nd, issued an executive order that made it easier to hire and fire certain civil servants, people now treated as civil servants. And the executive, I've quoted the executive order. It says, separating employees who cannot or will not meet required performance standards is important. And it is particularly important with regard to employees in confidential, policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating positions. High performance by such employees can meaningfully enhance agency operations, while poor performance can significantly hinder them. So these are people at FDA right now who are generally civil service protected and can't be ousted based on an election. And even this executive order isn't politically based. It's saying performance. It's saying, like, you know, if you're a poor performer versus a good performer, not are you on board with the administration policy or not. But I think we can read behind the lines that this would make it easier for an administration to put more people that it likes into these higher level positions that are not currently politically appointed. And so I think that is a wild card going forward. If the Trump administration continues, this will play out. And this, this would be, just so you know the specifics, it's going to be called Schedule F. And, you know, right now, civil service, there's Schedule A, C, D, and E. I think C are politically appointed, but don't quote me. But this would be a new F, and they would change the rules to adjust to this. And I think that if Biden wins, this will be perhaps the first order, the first executive order that they repeal. Because the federal workforce unions have already said they're opposed to it. The Democrats generally view the federal bureaucracy as their constituency. And Republicans have been praising this order as, and I saw one headline, I forgot to put the site, quote, opening a valve to drain the swamp. And the idea behind that is that there are these people in high up policymaking decisions who are you know, entrenched with government, favor the Democrat approach of more government, and aren't willing to implement conservative policies even when, you know, the president is elected as a conservative. And so that's the way they view that. So this order will either be, I think, a big change, potentially big change in the way the government operates, or it'll be gone in a few weeks or a few months. And we don't know which. That will depend on the election. I remember when I was, this is a long time ago, but I was in the HW administration for 9 months until he lost the election. And I was actually one of these people who would probably be Schedule F. I was civil service protected, but I was in a pretty high up legal advisory job in the Office of Legal Counsel at Justice. And I helped with an executive order that was called the Beck Order. And it was a big deal. It was mostly, you know, political campaign thing, but I got invited to the Rose Garden signing, and I sat right in front of Charlton Heston, which was kind of exciting. And anyway, when Clinton came in, the Beck Order was literally the first order that his first executive order repealed the Beck Order. So I see this as being similar if Biden wins. Okay, and now this was the chart that I was going to get to before. This is kind of the view from the commissioner's office, I would call it. This is the structure of FDA. This is the FDA org chart down to a certain level, and see if you can find CDRH. It's not easy to find. But you'll see the bottom row has the Biologics Drug Center, the Device Center, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, which is inspections and field operations, and the Center for Tobacco. So as you can see, you know, the commissioner's office is very large, and there's a lot of offices and a lot of stuff going on to run the agency, I guess. And the operational centers that we as device lawyers or regulatory affairs professionals or drug lawyers or regulatory affairs professionals in that area that we deal with is all the way at the bottom of the org chart. So that's why I say, you know, the political people, I believe, are all up in these top blue boxes. And maybe not even, you know, not completely, the office of the chief scientist, I doubt that's politically appointed, but, you know, at least some of them are up there. But when you have to go a long way down to get to these centers. And that's why I say the election doesn't affect them as much as you think it would, at least from a personnel perspective. This is the CDRH organization chart. And, ORA is obviously involved in inspections, not shown here, but OPEQ is really the only, you know, when you go down from the center director, the OPEQ is really the one that we care about as regulatory advisors. And it's called a super office. I don't know what that means. And if you go, whoops, it's a little hard to control here. Here we go. OPEQ, this is the OPEQ structure. And so you even go further, you know, have further layers of management. So you finally get down to the offices where the people who review the 510Ks and the PMAs and all that stuff, where that goes on. So I'm just trying to give everyone a picture of, you know, we think these offices loom large in my life, but they're actually at the bottom of a very, very long food chain. And I've been finding this out with EUAs. Once we get an EUA out of one of these offices, I think it has to, I've been told that it goes through 7 levels of review of people I have no idea who they are, mostly in the commissioner's office. So once again, there is, and I think this is deliberate, the scientific review staff and the enforcement folks are insulated from the political winds by many layers of bureaucracy. But there is a political impact. It's just not going to be very as direct. So the regulatory work is well below the offices that have the political comings and goings. And this slide just reiterates HHS directs FDA, FDA commissioner directs the centers and ORA, and then they direct the management of those entity offices, directs the actual regulatory reviews, inspections, and compliance and so forth. And all of that subterranean activity is largely fixed by law. So CDRH is a law-based regulation of medical devices. You have your laws and statutes, your regulations or rules, and then you have guidance documents. So that all of that is not, you know, does not change rapidly. It doesn't change just on it with every election. So now I'm going to talk about the statutes, the first bullet on the previous slide. And the statutes, interestingly enough, oops, sorry, I skipped, is in looking at these and thinking about them, it's, you know, it's actually fairly bipartisan. The 1976 medical device amendments was, I would say, it's fair to say, a Democrat creation, and it was a Democrat Congress, and I think Jimmy Carter was in office. It was May 28, 1976. So I can't remember. I think that's right. But it was a Democrat creation. So was the Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990. I don't know about mammography. I suspect it was. I mean, but for the Safe Medical Devices Act, George H. Bush would have signed that. So, you know, it was a Democrat Congress, but he signed it, so it was bipartisan. And same thing with the MQSA. So then, you know, 94, the Republicans took over the Congress, but Bill Clinton was still president when FDAMA was signed. And MEDUFMA was under Bush with a Republican Congress, and so was FDA in 2007. And, you know, I would say it's fair to say they were more industry friendly than the originating statutes, including particularly the Safe Medical Devices Act, which created a lot of the compliance regulatory structure. So, I think the Republicans were more industry friendly, but I think it was also pretty bipartisan. Clinton, as I said, Clinton signed FDAMA, which was a big update, and also, gave industry a lot of what they wanted. Now, when you get to 2010, I threw the Affordable Care Act, and I don't think there was anything substantive, but I just want to point out that excise tax on medical devices, which at the time, my reaction to that was, when you tax something, you get less of it. Why would we want to tax medical devices of all things? And I think the political answer is pharma got on board with the Affordable Care Act, and their support was critical to passing it. They had opposed prior, Democrat overhauls, and the device trade groups refused to get on board the Affordable Care Act train. And I believe they were punished with that excise tax, which hung over the device industry for many years, although it kept being suspended. And it was finally repealed, I think, in the 2017 tax reform. FDASIA was another one that was bipartisan. By then, the Republicans had taken back the House, and also Barack Obama was in office. And notice it says safety and innovation. So safety is kind of the Democrat emphasis that I've seen, and innovation is more the Republican emphasis, and this was both. And in fact, it was a bipartisan compromise that had something for everyone, or for both. And notice that also during the Obama years, there was very little legislation because of the gridlock with the Republican House, and yet you get FDA statutes twice, both FDASIA in 2012 and then the Cures Act, I think, was passed at the end of 2016, right? I think before before Trump took office. And I hope I'm getting that chronology right. Yeah, I think I am. And both the Cures Act also had some things that Democrats wanted and things that Republicans wanted. So FDA reform is something that the parties can actually get together on, which is unusual these days. I also want to point out, and I don't know how this happened, I haven't looked into it, but the CARES Act for the pandemic actually included a huge overhaul of the OTC monograph drug regulation, which is something that's been needed for decades, and somehow it got in on the back of this pandemic relief legislation, and I'm quite certain it was a bipartisan agreement, and that is going to change the way OTC monograph drugs are regulated in some important ways. So that happened just this year. So FDA regulation can get done, or statutory reform can get done even when a lot of other things are gridlocked. And therefore, just as a preview, one of my predictions is that will continue no matter who wins the election. So the key, I'm just listing the device regulations. And the reason I'm listing them is just to give you a sense of this large body of rules that have been enacted over time, which don't change very quickly, which survive, they're going to survive this regulation, this election, no matter who wins. And so I won't go through all the regulations, but there they are. And it's a huge determinant of what FDA does that is, I won't say eternal, but it's, it changes very slowly. And, the UDI is new, although it took long enough. That was mandated back in 2007 under FDASIA. So it takes time for these regulations to be issued, and they're not changed very often. I think everyone would agree that, President Trump himself has touted his deregulation of the economy and the government, and rescinding unnecessary regulations, or those that are claimed to be unnecessary. I won't pass judgment. And the Brookings Institute, which leans left, has a tracker of deregulation in the Trump era. So I went to look at it, and I filtered out everything that wasn't healthcare, and then looked through to find, what's been done in FDA. And this is the list. This is pretty much the whole list of what's claimed to be deregulation. One is an emergency notice permitting the use of certain medical devices. So that's EUAs. I don't think that's deregulation. That's unless, the EUAs are to meet the pandemic. It's not like changing the law to deregulate anything. And then a rule clarifying the definition of biological products to reduce uncertainty, a rule allowing minimal risk clinical investigations to bypass or alter certain informed consent requirements. I think I blogged on that some time ago. A rule expanding the definition of tobacco products. That's the deeming rule. That's sort of a politically charged thing, and it's also been batted around in the courts quite a bit. Repealing the requirement for irradiated drugs to obtain an FDA, NDA, or ANDA, which I was not aware of until I looked at this tracker. A rule redefining the standard for evaluating intended uses. So first of all, a couple of observations. One is these are kind of small potatoes. I mean, this is the big Trump deregulation for FDA. And you can see that not a lot has changed. I mean, they haven't done any major surgery on FDA regulation. These are all, small potato. There's a tendency these are technical fixes and clarifications, which is good. I think the Republicans like clarity in administrative law. I'm not saying the Democrats want confusion, but it's just not an emphasis. And also that last rule on intended uses is really interesting because this was a whole controversy, and I don't have time for the whole thing, but the rule was initially issued under the Obama administration, and it sort of, let's just say, enhanced FDA's ability to regulate off-label communications in ways that industry was very unhappy with. It was put on hold when Trump came in. FDA, it's been kicking around for 5 years. And the interesting thing is the version that just came out, it does what industry wanted in going back to the original concept, which was to take a certain sentence out of there that is problematic, relating to your knowledge of off-label use. But then it throws in a couple of things that I would say industry is not happy with, but FDA really wants. And that's an example of, that could have been the Obama administration. It could have been any administration. It's FDA pro-regulatory, in their favoring their position. And the Trump administration didn't stop that. So this is why I say at this level, at this technical level, there's not as much political control. Okay. And then these are two pending rules right now. And they're one of them is just implementing the Cures Act with regard to software. And the other one is, the second one is regulation that would govern the de novo process, which was created in 1997, but there's never been a regulation specifying the procedures, and that's what this would be. And that, that's pretty technical. It's not very political. And then they're updating regulation of sun lamps. That's it. So, this is, even so we just talked about deregulation, even on the initiating regulatory side, this is not exactly a earth shaking, and it's mostly very technical. So bottom line on this part of what I'm saying is that, shifting priorities may affect pre-market, post-market activity at the margins. For the most part, the statutes and regulations do not rapidly respond to elections, although there is some of that. FDA's bread and butter work is very technical, and safety and effectiveness are very highly valued by the public and by the politicians. And so they're almost afraid to interfere too much and then get blamed. So the political system involvement tends to be high level. And unless FDA or industry asks for a statutory fix to a technical problem like de novo, and the de novo was a response to a problem in 1997. We don't have time to go into it, but there was a major problem that fixed. And then 2012, there were problems with this 1997 statute, and they were fixed in 2012, in my opinion. And that fix was also requested by either FDA or industry or both, I'm not sure, but the politicians would never have initiated that, but they did agree to fix it. And that's the kind of politics that you often get. So a little bit more flavor. So I went back and looked at the political platforms of the parties for FDA. What did they have to say about FDA? So first of all, the interesting thing was, so for the GOP, this platform was adopted in 2016, and they didn't bother to change it in 2020. They just said we'll just keep the same platform. So that tells you it was not a huge priority, and it was also kind of high level because it didn't change. And I bolded, you can see the emphasis on innovation, getting rid of red tape. It's killing new drugs and devices, not enough predictability, consistency, transparency and efficiency and so forth. And we want all that. And it says FDA needs to return to its traditional emphasis on hard science and approving new breakthroughs rather than diverting attention and going into over-regulating electronic health records and vaping. Electronic health records was taken off the table in the Cures Act. FDA doesn't regulate that anymore. So it's pretty high level, as you can see. And then I looked at the Democrat platform, and you can't find the word FDA in any of their platforms. I went back to, I said 2012. I think I even looked at 2008, and they just don't address FDA. And as I said, the GOP kind of just repeated what they did in 2016 again. So, the parties pay attention to FDA, but they don't inject themselves into the structure of the regulatory, FDA's regulation of drugs and devices very deeply. The pandemic has brought about the most political scrutiny of FDA that we've seen in decades, and I think it will reverberate. And after the election, and the election will kind of affect this. So, and obviously, we don't have time to go into the whole history of all this and all of what's been going on, but we can get the flavor of it. So the pandemic, one of the issues, just the most recent is vaccines, which has been very political. The Trump administration wanted a vaccine before the election. The Democrats, I won't say they wanted it after the election, but they raised concerns. And FDA decided at the agency level to impose some certain criteria, probably maybe stricter than normal, for testing to make sure this thing is safe and effective. And the White House was very unhappy with that and put the guidelines under review. And you can read this quote and see the story. But the main point is that even on this very, very important issue to the president, the White House caved because they from a political perspective, and they were not willing to take the heat for overriding FDA on safety and effectiveness, and then of course being responsible if it's a disaster, that could have been avoided had FDA done what they wanted to do. So these issues are too technical, and yet they're sufficiently momentous in terms of life and death and public perception of the government, that the political system, even on this issue, couldn't bring itself to overrule FDA. And so that was interesting. Now, the other issue I'll mention, because we can only touch on the surface of this, a lot has happened in this pandemic that I think is going to affect FDA. FDA has been front and center along with the CDC. So this goes back to the LDT issue. In early January, the Chinese scientists published the genetic sequence of the new coronavirus, and laboratories then could start designing tests to detect it and diagnose it. And what happened was the CDC actually designed a test, and FDA approved it very quickly, I think February 4th, really quickly. But then FDA also started basically making it very difficult for anyone other than the CDC to have a test. First of all, FDA asserted jurisdiction over these LDTs, which was not a foregone conclusion. They generally don't regulate LDTs, even though they always claim the authority to do so. So they went ahead and did that, and that was somewhat unprecedented. And they were putting burdens on those developing these tests that basically slowed them down significantly. And so for a month, the CDC test was the only one available, which would have been great, except they botched the test. It did not work properly. It had to be redesigned. And for that entire month of February, which was very critical, we didn't have any testing for the coronavirus, basically. And that was, basically a botch, both by the CDC and frankly the FDA, because there are other organizations who could have stepped in to replace that CDC test, and they were prevented from doing so. So that has brought a lot of criticism, and I think that's going to be coming back to bite FDA later on, particularly if the Trump administration wins, maybe less so if Biden wins. So all that said, what might the election bring? Well, let me just step through, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to go through a little more quickly this segment, but these are headlines. These are ripped from the headlines, although not always yesterday's headlines, because thanks to Google. So these are recent congressional Democrat proposals or statements about FDA that I found. They have introduced some Democrats have introduced legislation to revise FDA requirements for LGBT blood donors. They were excluded due to mostly male due to HIV, and there's pressure now to change the requirements to allow gay males to donate. FDA, Democrats were pushing FDA to do something about quote unquote forever chemicals in bottled water. And FDA created a pre-certification, digital health pre-certification pilot, and Democrats very publicly questioned whether FDA was compromising safety. So again, pushing back on innovation and streamlining, and saying, what about safety? On the Republican side, this is what I found. I found 20 Republican senators petitioned the FDA to ban the abortion pill, pro-life, and there was an act introduced, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, which had various things to incentivize competition, mainly through generics. And so, again, you see the emphasis on, well, pro-life and also free market. You see the difference in emphasis in Congress. Let's see. And then NPR had a contrasting Biden versus Trump just a few days ago or a couple of weeks ago. And Biden was focused on lowering prescription drug prices in Medicare, an independent commission on drugs, getting rid of tax breaks to pharmaceuticals. This is in the service of lowering prices. Meantime, Trump, first of all, has actually, prices went down for the first time in 50 years under Trump through various actions he's taken. And he's also made a series of executive orders. Most significantly is basically creating most favored nation or status, or I'm not sure how you describe it, but basically saying the drug companies, if they're charging a lot less overseas, they have to do the same here. Which would be a sea change. Is actually something the Democrats have sometimes proposed. Republicans have always resisted, and Trump is totally on board with that. So two different ways of lowering prices, and of course, neither of them really related to FDA, but I thought they at least give you some flavor of the difference in philosophy. And to some extent, the Republicans do rely on generics, to lower prices, and that does affect FDA. So I am finishing up with enough time to have some questions. So I'm giving you my final predictions. After the election, no matter who wins, there is going to be a look back at FDA's actions during the pandemic. And I'm using a neutral term, look back, as opposed to inquisition or investigation. But FDA has good and bad on its account, and this is an unprecedented pandemic, so that's actually probably pretty natural. There will be, in my opinion, prediction, 3 questions. What did FDA do wrong? I think that's going to be bipartisan. Was there political interference, especially regarding the vaccine? I think only the Democrats will pursue that if Biden wins and if the Democrats take the Congress. and what lessons can be drawn to improve normal FDA operations. I think the Republicans are going to be interested in that. Maybe some Democrats. I'm not, but I don't think they're going to be that excited about it. And my prediction is that the look back will lead to bipartisan statutory change in the Food and Drug Statute, no matter who wins. What that change will be, I'm not going to try to predict. And I just threw this up. Jeff Shuren, the head of the Device Center, has already made the point. The point of this slide is he basically says it would be a great tragedy if we don't learn from the pandemic, both with regard to preparing for another pandemic, but also our normal operations. And that gets to the issue of EUAs. It's been really interesting. I've been involved in at least a dozen EUAs now. The emergency use authorizations are an interactive process. And so while 510Ks and PMA are not interactive, you give FDA a complete response, they review it, they give you your deficiencies or your decision, and there's this sort of back and forth that takes time. And the EUAs have been interactive, and in some ways in some ways in the beginning when they were doing these fairly quickly, it was a burden on both sides of the table because they would get back to us quicker, then we had to get back to them quickly, and there was no break, and it was back and forth, and it actually was it felt unsustainable. It felt like it was an unsustainable burden on FDA. But maybe there's a way they could incorporate more interaction in their processes than they have to date, because it helped speed the process up tremendously. In later months, they have been so flooded with EUAs that the whole thing has become somewhat slower and more difficult, just because of the volume of what they're trying to handle, because there are no limits on what they do. But interaction is one of the things that I've seen and gotten a taste of and really liked. I mean, I had FDA people literally calling me on Friday night, or calling me on Saturday, having a conference call and asking me for a response by Sunday. And while I don't think that's a sustainable thing, more interaction in the review process, I think, would make it more efficient and just less confusing for the FDA reviewers, because they can get their questions answered quickly, and move the ball forward and not make mistakes based on misunderstanding. So I think I'm going to stop there because I'm out of slides, and also I would like to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really great. We do have a few questions from our listeners. The first is sort of a follow-up question on lab-developed tests. Do you anticipate seeing further policy shifts with regard to LDTs?
Oh, okay. I'm glad you asked that, because we just touched on that. So as I mentioned, LDTs have been a hotspot for 30 years, and it's mostly been a battle between FDA and the industry. HHS hasn't really been involved. HHS now has, and actually the Politico somehow obtained the internal legal opinion that was leaked. It's a memo issued by the General Counsel in June of 2020, which basically says FDA does not have complete legal authority over LDTs. They have limited authority in certain cases. And I haven't really read the whole thing in detail, but this was the justification for taking the COVID LDTs away from FDA. And so I think the issue has been joined, and I think there will be a resolution. There has been legislation working through Congress over the last couple of years to settle what authority FDA has, and actually to give FDA some authority over LDTs, and then but to structure it in Congress as to what it will and won't be, and not have FDA just decide it. So I do have a prediction that this issue will get resolved in the next 4 years, but I think it will happen no matter which administration we have. And it will happen regardless of whether the Democrats or the Republicans control the Congress, is my prediction.
Okay. The next question comes from a small medical device company with regard to inspections. The company experienced a pretty big difference in the way inspections were conducted under the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Do you think that has more to do with the administrations themselves or the restructuring of the office that is conducting the investigations?
I think that, you know, the FDA reformed how they were inspecting. Like, the biggest difference is that inspectors have always been expected to inspect peanuts, medical devices, drugs, biologics, what you name it. And, you know, I couldn't keep up with all the rules on all of those anymore. And I don't think it was made sense to have the inspectors do it. And that was one of the reforms, was creating people who specialize and really understand, say, devices. And so I don't think that that is really very political. I think it was more of a technical in the sense of non-political, you know, kind of an improvement to how FDA operates. And it has had an impact, but it's not based on, you know, Democrat versus Republican. That's my opinion.
There is a question about FDA approving or the process of approving tests under EUAs. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how it has streamlined from the beginning of the pandemic to now?
Well, getting diagnostic tests through the EUA process is not that easy. FDA actually initially said they didn't need to review antibody serology tests, and they got slammed for it. But that's old technology. I think the real problem there was that, you know, a lot of the tests were foreign made and of uncertain quality. In theory, that was a good decision, but in reality, people objected to it. And so they got, you know, those for EUAs, and it also, they put a lot of resources into laboratory tests for EUAs, which I think was not a good idea, because though the laboratories do have pretty high quality standards and can, you know, the ability to conduct a test fairly. And so that may have been an area they could have saved their resources. Now HHS has made them do it. In general, the templates for EUAs for diagnostic tests are fairly detailed and actually, you know, pretty rigorous. And the EUAs, you know, can take months. So even though they're interactive, because of the volume and because they are pretty rigorous, it's still a significant review process. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my comment on that.
Okay. We have a question about the device tax. Is there any likelihood that that will be resurrected?
I don't think so. I think it's gone finally. I believe it was a tax reform of, was it 2017 or 2018? But the major Trump tax reform, I believe, I'm not a politico, but I believe they repealed the tax.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. I'm sure that's good news for everyone listening. Let's see, another question just came in. There has been a shift in interaction with FDA going through the very formal submission issue meetings to more interactive review. And this has made the review process quicker, and the ability to gain clarity interactively has been beneficial. Do you see this reverting to a more formal process, or do you think the interactive review will continue?
That's a great question. So I think, I agree with what was stated. I think going forward, first of all, I don't see this as truly election dependent. Although I think if the Republicans win, I think they will be more receptive to how do we kind of incorporate this in the normal process. It was driven by the pandemic, but sometimes you learn things like in war and in pandemics, you know, advances are made sometimes, and this seems like people have gotten a taste of this. The FDA folks have gotten a taste of it. I suspect they don't want to do this, you know, they don't want EUAs forever. But I think everyone may be open to how do we make the process more interactive? Because the pre-submission process was supposed to be the sort of the informal way for doing this, but it's as, it's at least a 2-month process, if not longer. I mean, the FDA gives themselves like 75 days, and it's in some ways just another submission. And so, it's not, and this is a pendulum that swings back and forth. There was a time when people used to be able to pick up the phone a long time ago and just call FDA. And then under, I think it was Kessler, the decision was made, FDA officials should never answer the phone. And that was a disaster. And, and now it's sort of a balance. But if you have a significant question, you have to go through the pre-submission, which is 75 days and, not cheap. In terms of preparation time and all that. So it's a perennial issue. They have limited resources, but I do believe that there will be an effort to incorporate or learn from this and incorporate more interaction in the future, no matter who wins the election.
On the same topic, do you anticipate that the PMA or 510K process would be affected by having a different party in the executive?
No, I can't see that. It's too technical. Politicians don't want to interfere with it, and I don't see any immediate appetite for changing the statutory standards or anything like that. So no, I don't think so. Okay.
And what about drug pricing? You touched on this a little bit in the presentation. Do you think that would you anticipate an impact of the election outcome on drug pricing?
Yeah, in a way, yes. I think both parties are focused on that now. The Republicans didn't used to be, but they are now under Trump. That's one of his signature issues. But I think the parties have different ideas about how to obtain it. Trump did steal the sort of the most favored nation from the Democrats. I think both parties might do that, and Canadian importation. But the Republicans also, like the idea of generic competition, driving down prices. I think the Democrats it's just not one of the tools they look to. So I think that they're more into command and control. You saw the proposed HHS Secretary would do, negotiations with hospitals and antitrust against mergers and acquisition. Ironically, a lot of that M&A activity is directly due to the Affordable Care Act. So it's ironic that the Democrats would be against that, but they're going to look for cost control rather than market forces. Republicans are going to look for market forces, but both sides are wanting to bring drug prices down.
Okay. One last question just came in. Do you anticipate that the pre-submission review times for 510Ks could go beyond 60 to 70 days because of COVID?
Yes, it already has in at least one case that I was involved in. And in fact, the FDA reviewer even called me, and first of all, they took a long time to schedule it, and they scheduled it a little bit late, and then they called and asked for an extension, which I agreed to, obviously. But yeah, they're swamped. In diagnostics, you might not even be able to do a pre-sub. Right now, a lot of those are they're on hold, or don't even bother to file it in diagnostics. And I think the whole agency is under strain. And yes, so I think the pre-subs are going to diminish significantly unless things turn around on the pandemic. Let's say the vaccine and therapeutics kind of make it an issue that kind of diminishes.
One last question for you. If the Democrats win the table and win the White House and Congress, do you think that there might be larger changes for FDA on the horizon than you suggested?
Yes, I think that's possible. So first of all, they've threatened to end the filibuster. So if they run the table and then end the filibuster, they'll be able to push through legislation that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And I'm not sure what it would be, but I'm sure, I'm sure it would be more weighted towards increased regulation, probably, increased authority for FDA. And some of the things that we've been talking about that are, the Democrat themes. But I don't see them, drastically, there isn't like a groundswell for drastic overhaul of FDA and the way it regulates these products. So it will be a matter of degree, but I could see significant legislation that that seemed not possible the last 30 years. They could put that through.
Okay, I think that is all we have time for. We're a few minutes over. Thank you very much, Jeff. This is a very timely and interesting subject, and I know your presentation will be valuable to our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.